But hello, everybody. It's great to see you here this afternoon. My name is Isabella Miller, and I am a part of the team here at ICCS, as well as our sister school, Animas. And I am delighted to introduce our speaker today, Nick Bolton, who is the founder and CEO of both the ICCS and Animas. Joining us live today from Myanmar, Nick's lecture will be exploring the foundational pillars of coaching and supervision, exploring how supervisors can deepen their understanding of these core functions and their interplay in practice. So really exciting lecture, especially to kick off the new year. Before I hand over to Nick, I just wanted to share a few housekeeping rules for today. So please make sure that you are on mute throughout the call today. The chat will be off whilst Nick is speaking, but you will be able to contact me directly if there are any issues at all. We will be stopping throughout the lecture for Q&A time. So Nick will indicate to me when we will do that, and you'll be able to ask a question using the chat function. You will notice that we are recording today, but we will be editing out the questions to preserve privacy. So yeah, that's my housekeeping rules for today. As mentioned, please do feel free to message me directly if you need anything at all. But with that, I'm going to hand over to yourself now, Nick. Yes.
Thank you very much, Izzy. And let me quickly take a look at the gallery. It's always nice to see all the faces of human beings that have taken time to be with us today. So thank you so much for being here. Yes, wonderful. It's good to see familiar faces from ICCS and some from Animas as well, and some from both, of course, because there's also crossover, but it's lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you taking time out of your day during the daytime. The reason why we did a daytime one is, as Izzy said, I'm in Myanmar, which is 6.5 hours ahead of the UK. So if I were to do a normal 7 o'clock one, it'd be like middle of the night, which is what's happening to me in Animas next week. I've got a lecture at 2 in the morning because I made that mistake. So hence why it's lunchtime. Thank you for being here during your lunch. Alrighty, let's get cracking because we only have an hour. And I appreciate that time is of the essence when it comes to trying to cover a topic like this within such a short time. And as Izzy said, I will be stopping as we go, just to make sure we're tracking, keeping pace together. Just because I don't want to kind of leave people behind who perhaps haven't got the same background in supervision as others who are here. So let me just share my screen, and then we will go. So extra housekeeping. It's only 60 minutes. It's mainly content. I apologize for that. There isn't much interaction, but there will be Q&A. I realized once I was putting it together, I was like, wow, 60 minutes will fly by. More for me than you. You might think 60 minutes is a long time, but when you're the speaker, it whizzes by. So I will definitely endeavor to cover all the questions, but we won't have much interaction. I will also want to warn you that we are getting intermittent power cuts here in Myanmar. If that does happen, it's likely to cut off the internet, but it will only be for like a minute, less than a minute, like normally it's 20 seconds. So if it does go power cut here, just hang on in there. It will come back. Now this lecture is aimed at, by the way, if I can ask you to mute yourselves, that'd be great. Yeah, this talk is aimed at supervisors, but it's also for non-supervisors, and I want to kind of see who's in the room shortly. But I just want you to know that I have tried to keep it broad enough that anyone can track along with me, but it certainly is aimed at supervisors most of all. Having said that, this is the very first lecture I've done, I think, for ICCS, and so I'm not sure whether I'll be giving you some delicious Easter eggs to eat, or will I be teaching you to suck eggs? I really don't know. I'm not really quite sure how this is going to land for you. And when I do ANMAS lectures, they're always quite highfalutin philosophical ones, but with this, it's kind of more practical. I'm not sure the extent to which it's going to challenge you to think differently, or you just be like, he's told me nothing new. And I apologize if I tell you nothing new. I hope I do. Let's see. So I want to do a quick straw poll, which is, first of all, I need to go to my gallery for this. Who here is a qualified or in training supervisor? Just put your little yellow hand up if you would. I can just have a quick peek through. Oh, Ruth Randler, no, you are. Okay, so quite a few. That's great. Okay, fantastic. Wow. I see somebody's got loads and loads of thumbs going up. Okay, if you guys can put your thumbs down, who's interested? You come here because you're kind of interested in becoming a supervisor and you're just curious about, what sits behind it. Okay, couple. Yeah, great. Who's considering getting a supervisor? So you're sort of, what gets covered in supervision? Is it worth me finding somebody? I'm not seeing any thumbs for that yet. Unless they're okay. And then finally, who's just curious? You're playing curious. You're kind of not really sure what's going on. It's like, yeah, I'll see what this is all about. All right. Wonderful. Okay, so it seems to me that the vast majority of people are qualified or in training supervisors, which really gives me a good steer for the lecture. But I will try to make sure that I cover everybody's needs. So what are we going to cover? Well, we're going to take a look at the three functions of supervision firstly, just to make sure we're all on the same page as to what do we mean by the three pillars of supervision or the three functions of supervision. Then we'll take a look at how they are independent of each other. In other words, they relate to each other. They're not three separate things that are done independently. We'll take a look at the risks of a single function approach, by which I mean the kind of tendency there is to look at one function and do that function to the exclusion of the other two. And then we'll take a look at how you move towards an integrated approach with these functions. And then I'll introduce a model I created called the 4 C's model. There's always a good model, and it usually has C's in it, doesn't it? For some weird reason. I'm not sure why. You don't get many, like 5 F's. It's always the 4 C's, but there you go. That's life. So the 4 C's of integrating the three functions. And finally, I'll take a look at what I think was some potential challenges to the integration of these three functions. How can it become a little bit tricky to try to integrate them? But first of all, start with what are the three functions? Well, look, first of all, let's think about what is supervision. Simply, supervision is a reflective conversation in relationship between a coach, sometimes called a supervisee, and the supervisor, looking at the supervisee's practice. In particular, they're looking at three main areas, and that is their effectiveness as a coach, their well-being as a coach, and their ability to adhere to or work within the norms of the profession as a whole. And as you'll notice, there are three things I just said, and those are fundamentally the three functions. So we can think of them as the formative, the normative, and the restorative. Now, those three were named formative, normative, and restorative by Inskip and Proctor back in 1980-something, I believe, in a paper that's very, 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 very hard to get hold of for some weird reason, because it's an absolutely seminal concept, the idea of formative, normative, and restorative. Now, having said that, those three have been played with and adjusted by different people, so you've got different versions, but these three have stood the test of time, I think, primarily because of their kind of poetic memorability. There's such a beautiful trio that it's hard to forget them. So I think formative, normative, restorative, they've stuck. And what they fundamentally are looking at is those three things I mentioned: effectiveness as a coach, the ability for the coach to adhere to and behave within the norms of the profession, and finally, the well-being of the coach. So we have skills and development, we have ethics and standards, and we have well-being and self, concept of self, if you like. So one of the ways that over the years I've thought about this is somewhat more simply, which is that the formative is looking at the person as a coach. How are they performing as a coach? Then the normative is that the coach as a professional. How are they working as a professional, as a member of a profession? And then finally, the restorative is flipping the first one on its head and saying, okay, here's a coach, but they're also a person. How are they functioning as a person? What's happening to them as an individual? So these three functions of supervision really are the mainstay of the work we do as supervisors. It's to take a step back and then to help the supervisee look at these three areas of practice in different ways. How are they behaving? How are they behaving as a coach? How are they performing as a coach? And how are they feeling as a coach? Fundamentally, that's what it's all about. I want to give you a couple of examples just to set the scene. So actually, I wish I could. I've lost the Zoom bit. I'm only seeing my presentation, but I'll see if I can find it, because I want to see your comments on this. If a supervisee says, I'm feeling so burned out and tired of my clients, we have a feeling what the function might be there. If they say, I've tried everything, and yet my client still seems stuck, can't seem to make any progress, we have a feeling what might be the right function, the right area of focus, let's say. And if they say, I've been asked by my client's manager to share their progress, we have a pretty good idea which function seems to be the appropriate one. Now, I can't see you, so I'm just going to move to the next slide and show you what I think is probably in your head and which I think is the normal answer, which is, I'm feeling so burned out and tired of my clients. we think restorative. We think, this is a restorative conversation. We think it's formative. I've tried everything, yet my client seems stuck. I wonder what different things you might try. Or we think, I've been asked by my client's manager to share the progress. It's a normative function. This is an ethical dilemma. We must take this down the ethical route. No, it makes a lot of sense, and we would probably be right to at least have that as the starting point. But what I want to challenge on this presentation is the simplicity of that single approach to this work. And I want to kind of set out a caveat, which is I realize that supervisors, especially experienced supervisors, don't think in silos. But my experience is more supervisors think in silos than would like to admit it. And I've seen a lot of supervision, and I've seen a lot of ways supervisors come to these three functions, and often they think, this is a restorative function, so I have to behave in a restorative way, which has a certain timbre. It has a certain quality to behave in a restorative way. And it's interesting when a supervisor goes into restorative mode, the feeling of that session is a lot more compassionate and a lot more holding the space. Does it have to be? No, it doesn't, but it tends to be. Likewise, when it goes into the formative function, it tends to be a little bit more analytic and teaching and informative, and let's kind of figure out a solution to this, and let's be a bit more solution focused and figure out a way forward, and da-da-da-da-da. It has this kind of feeling of figuring out a problem and figuring out what needs to be added. What's the extra bit of seasoning that gets added to this stew to make it taste nicer? And then finally, with the last one, normative. This is a very interesting one, because a lot of supervisors, especially newer ones, can be very hesitant with the normative function. They worry about bringing a normative lens to supervision. Why? Well, I think, and it's only my gut feeling, but I think it's because we are taught as coaches to park our opinions. And all of a sudden, we're being asked to have an opinion because we assume there's something to be normative to. And if there's something to be normative to, we have to have a shared concept of that. And it's like, who am I to have a normative concept if I'm a coach? Well, you're not a coach, you're a supervisor. So there's a lot of hesitancy in some supervisors adopting the normative function. And I hope that what I'm going to cover today actually will help start to make the normative feel a bit more comfortable by realizing actually you need to kind of blend the whole approach. So let's think about the risks of a single function approach. What do I mean by a single function approach, first of all? What I mean is a kind of siloing of your mind to think, I'm doing the formative function. I'm doing the normative function. I'm doing the restorative function. And by the way, I've really seen this. This is not something I'm making up in my head. I've seen supervisors do this, literally say, which of these are we doing today? As though somehow once you do one, you're not doing the others. So some of the risks of a single function approach are these. First of all, a missed opportunity for deeper reflection and growth in a more holistic sense about what's going on. And I'll give you some examples of this in a minute. But if we only look at one aspect, we miss the aspects around it, which are reflected in the other two areas that we're not looking at. So if we're only looking at restorative, we miss the formative and the normative, and we're missing potential material that needs to be surfaced, which might itself affect the restorative function that we're looking at. So emotional needs, ethical issues, or developmental gaps become unaddressed in favor of what might seem the obvious function and not the obvious direction. And by the way, they do sometimes feel obvious. And it's like, well, that's going to hit me on the head. It's so obvious. Doesn't matter. We're going to look at a 4Cs model in a minute, which will help you go, let's pause for a second and start to address this in a more holistic sense. One of the side effects of having a single function approach is that supervisors can feel unsupported because they are not getting all of their needs met. It might seem they are because it looks like a restorative approach that's needed, so you take a restorative, but they leave going, hold on, that's fine. I might feel a bit more comforted, but I still don't know what to do. Or they might say, I know what to do, but I'm not sure whether it's the right thing to do. And so they can feel in some way unsupported, stuck, or fenced in by your particular approach. And supervisors themselves can develop a limited approach, a limited set of approaches. In other words, they can become very formatively focused or very normatively focused or very restoratively focused. I will say this, very few supervisors are normatively focused. It's just the reality. I don't find many supervisors become overly normatively focused, if that makes sense. It tends to be either restorative or formative that become the dominant themes of their practice. And what I would encourage you to do is go, hold on, if I reflect on my supervision, is one of those three really becoming dominant in my practice, and why? Why is that? Is it because I feel more comfortable doing developmental growth work? Is it because I feel more comfortable doing comforting work? Or is it because I like to represent the professional body, or the profession as a whole? So to give you some examples of single lens risks in practice, if you took a restorative focus only, the emotional support is prioritized, but ethical and professional growth issues remain unaddressed. And so the client leaves a gut feeling, yeah, okay, I feel better, but it's not really helped anything. If you take a normative focus only, well, great, ethical oversight is done, but it becomes dominant and it can leave the supervisor feeling judged. It's like, wow, that felt a little bit like, that felt like I've done something wrong. It's not that you shouldn't address it, you absolutely should, but it's how is it addressed in such a way that the person can feel supported in across the board. And then if you have a formative focus only, then the emphasis is on skill building, but without the emotional or ethical considerations coming in. So those are like giving you a sense of, well, what gets missing when one becomes dominant. So let's think about how we might reframe the original examples. I'm feeling so burned out and tired of my clients. So as I said at the start, that might seem obviously a restorative conversation, right? You might think, this person's really struggling. I need to, really give them space to unload, and let's do some cathartic work maybe, or we're just going to let them become mindful, or whatever it might be that seems appropriate to you as a supervisor, or between you. It might be you collaborate on it, and you both collaborate on this kind of restorative journey that you go on. But one of the questions is, how might a formative approach address the underlying issues that led to the burnout? In other words, rather than simply tackling the symptom by taking a restorative approach to the emotional response, what if you were to look at the skill set, the developmental growth that's needed in order to address that burnout? Like, say, for instance, the burnout is caused by an inability to manage the inability is probably too strong a word, but a challenge within managing the client's emotional push towards you as a coach. Well, okay, if I can develop the skill to work with that, then all of a sudden burnout becomes less intense. Maybe it disappears completely because we took a formative approach to what seemed like a restorative issue. Now, of course, in reality, you are doing a restorative function at that point, but you're taking a formative approach to it. And this is my point, really. It's not that the restorative function isn't the right one, but sometimes we think restorative equals X. Restorative equals being soft. Restorative equals being spacious. Restorative equals being mindful. Restorative equals, etc., etc. We forget that being restorative isn't only about the feelings, it's about managing the stuff that creates those feelings in the first place. What about this? How might our normative approach uncover ethical dimensions to their current experience and feelings? For instance, wow, if you're tired of your clients, should you really be working with them? Now, that might sound pretty harsh to you. You might think, wow, Nick's a pretty tough dude. Like, here's this person struggling, and he's going to take their clients away from them. Number one, I can't do that anyway. But the point is, it's a conversation worth having. Hey, how are you serving your clients at this moment in time? If you're struggling this much, how are you serving them, and what needs to happen? That brings a normative approach to what seems like an obvious restorative question. Let's take a look at this one. I've tried everything, and yet my client seems stuck. Seems like a formative question, right? It's like, oh, what else might you do? What other skills might you need to develop, etc., etc. But what if a restorative approach enables the coach to release various pent-up frustrations before they look for the solution? What if they're not ready to look for a solution until they actually get it all off their chest? And sometimes if we move too quickly to, this is a formative issue, therefore I've got to go into what might you do differently, but they're really questioning their competence, and it's creating a suffering inside because they're like, oh my God, what's happened to me as a coach? I'm useless. Like, your attempt to be formative might fall on deaf ears, or might be, seeds sown on concrete. It might not work because the soil isn't ready to receive it. So you might find a restorative approach creates the right groundwork. How might a normative approach explore the coach efforting rather than partnering? If I've tried everything and yet my client seems stuck, it's almost like the coach feels a responsibility to do the work. Well, is that right? Is that what the job of a coach is, or is their job to partner? So it could be there's a normative aspect to this, which is, well, how are you behaving within the norms of the profession versus trying to be the solver, the solutions finder. And then I've been asked by my client's manager, to share their progress. Might seem like a normative question, but the reality is most coaches have a pretty good idea of what's right or wrong. The question is how they deal with it. So it might be a formative approach is needed to support the coach to develop new skills, to hold the boundaries. They know they need to hold the boundaries. It's not really a normative conversation. They're not going like, should I or shouldn't I? They're going, how the hell do I get around this? And it's actually, it could potentially be a formative issue. How do I develop the skills to have an honest conversation with somebody that doesn't alienate them, but does enable me to sit clearly with my boundaries? How might a restorative approach enable the coach to come back to their sense of self to do what they know is right? Maybe they've got the skills, maybe they don't need a formative approach, but somehow they've lost confidence in their ability to have that conversation, and they just need to come back to their stronger self. I always remember a wonderful concept by Nick Smith, who talked about the deference threshold. And there's a point where, as a coach, or indeed as a human being, you hit a deference threshold with another human being where you start to defer to them. Well, what if this coach has hit a deference threshold with the client's manager? So they know what they need to do. They even know how to do it. They just feel incapable of doing it because they've hit the deference threshold. It might be a restorative approach. Now, a couple of things. I've already mentioned this, but I'm going to give the caveat anyway. Most supervisors I know will naturally blend all three. So I'm not pretending this is incredibly revolutionary idea. Hey, let's look at all three. Wow, what a genius Nick is. No, I know that most of you are doing it. The question is, how deliberately are we doing it? So, because in my opinion, there's a tendency, especially in less experienced supervisors, to assume that a specific function has a specific focus and a timbre, as I call it, the feeling of that approach. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. I can't see your faces, but I'm hoping it makes sense. That the restorative approach has a certain feeling, and the normative has a certain feeling, and so on. And what I'd love to do is to, help supervisors to move across all three in a way that's extremely effective for helping the whole system get the benefits. So let me pause for a second. I'm going to collapse my screen so I can see you. Let's get zoom back. And let's see if there are any questions, thoughts, reflections at this stage, because I'm rattling through this. Half hour's gone nearly. Izzy, anything coming up?
Yeah, there's two reflections, and I'm going to encourage people to keep asking questions and put their reflections in the chat. One that came up was, I felt the approach as presented was limiting. I saw overlap between the areas. I'm not sure if you want to expand on that, Milami. But that's one reflection. And then Ivana says, all of these examples are nicely linked to the ICF competencies and code of ethics.
Good. Well, I'm glad they are. I hadn't done that deliberately, but that's great to hear. Regarding the first point, I mean deliberate as in the sense of deliberate practice. There's a saying, isn't there? Have you really done 10,000 hours, or have you done 1 hour 10,000 times? Because if you don't do deliberate practice, you've probably done 1 hour 10,000 times. Deliberate practice is the conscious attempt to grow as a practitioner. So when I say deliberate, I don't mean you're deliberately doing it in the moment, but you're being deliberate in your consciousness of the systemic approach to these three things. Make sense? Thanks, Michelle. And by the way, because you're an experienced supervisor, it doesn't surprise me that you saw the complexity of those issues. But my experience as a particularly neurosupervisor do tend to take quite a siloed approach to these things, which is coming right back to my first point, which is, blimey, I don't know how others are going to sit with this group, because you might all be sitting there going, this guy's teaching me to suck eggs, which if I am, I apologize. I just hope there's a bit of salt and spice on them. All right, let's go back to the presentation. Any other thoughts there, Izzy? Questions?
Yeah, there was one from Sarah. Separating the function to be used into the approach used to introduce that function is helpful.
Separating the function to be used into the approach used. Yes, okay. Yeah, I think what I'm hearing Sarah there talk about is that we can tend to think we're doing a certain function, but not think about how we're doing that function. And actually recognizing that almost unconsciously there's an approach to each function, and beginning to say, well, how can I be more blended is actually useful. That might not be what Sarah meant, but that's how I'm taking it. All right. Okay, let me go back to showing my screen. Or maybe I already am. Okay. So towards an integrated approach. So this is how I think about integrating this. Integrating the restorative, normative, and formative functions in supervision is about consciously and deliberately, going back to my point to Michelle, consciously and deliberate practice, exploring well-being, ethical awareness, and professional growth in a way that meets the supervisee where they are, and this is a really critical part, whilst ensuring the needs of the whole system are met. Anyone who's new to supervision might think that the thing we care about as a supervisor is the coach, and that's true. But part of the approach to supervision, part of supervision is the ability to hold the whole system in our mind's eye. In other words, we have our coach, our supervisee, but we also have to think about their clients, and we also have to think about the system that's all part of, including the organization or the family or whatever it might be. And we think about the profession we are all part of. And so if we're only looking at the needs of the person in front of us, the supervisee, we're not looking at the whole system. And therefore, I was going to use the F word then, which is fail. And I don't mean to, but if we're then failing to do our job, if we're only looking at the needs of the supervisee, we're failing to do our job as a supervisor, which is to look at the whole system. And that's why I think moving towards an integrated approach is really critical, because we have to make sure that we're not just looking at what they think they need in the moment, but how does that start to have ramifications for the rest of the system. So here's my 4 C's model. Number 1, C, clarify the core need. 2, contextualize the need. 3, connect the dots. And 4, co-create actions and reflections. Now, I'm just thinking about the PowerPoint slide or the Google slide. So I think, Izzy, we can probably produce this as a PDF, can't we, and send it to the people on this call. I would imagine we can do that. So we'll commit to that. I hope we can commit to that. We'll get this out to you, because I know what it's like when you're listening to a talk. It's quite hard to take loads of notes at the same time. And I think this model could be useful for some of you, if not all of you, in some small way. So clarify the core need, contextualize the need, connect the dots, co-create actions and reflections. Let's take a look at each, and then we'll do some examples. So first of all, we're going to work with the supervisors to identify their primary focus. I showed those other ones earlier. I think they're the primary focus is the restorative, is the normative, etc. So let's clarify the core need. Now, this is an entry point, but it begins to kind of open up deeper layers, which will emerge as we have the conversations. Then we contextualize the need. We explore how the dominant function connects to the wider coaching context, client dynamics, or systemic factors. This will broaden the perspectives and surfaces links between the 3 functions. Next up is connect the dots. So here we're actively bridging the 3 functions. We are looking at how the emotions and the ethics and the growth interweave in different ways to deepen the insight and help the supervisee see a fuller picture of their practice. And then finally, co-create actions and reflections, support the supervisee in identifying next steps that integrate all 3 functions where appropriate. We're not shoving it in for the sake of it. Ensuring emotional resilience, ethical responsibility, and professional growth are explored. This ensures the whole supervision system is considered. It's got the whole world in his hands. So that's the 4 C's model. Let's take a look at an example. And we're going to take a look at the overwhelmed coach scenario. A coach is struggling with emotional exhaustion and says he is absorbing too much of his client's stress and negative energy from their toxic work environments. That's a very typical issue that might be brought to supervision. Like, it's just, wow. I mean, I remember years ago having this client who just could not stand the organization she worked for. She loved her clients and she had a lot of compassion for them, almost to the state of collusion, because she saw the organization as the kind of the baddie, so to speak. And so this kind of idea that clients are bringing all this emotion and that we begin to absorb this stress and negativity or negative energy is a very, very common one in supervision. And we might say, well, that's obviously a restorative issue. The coach is struggling. It's the restoration. Let's take a look. So clarify the core need. It might sound like a restorative issue, but is it? Ask the coach questions to surface their concerns first. What is your biggest concern with this? What they might say is, I'm worried my clients aren't getting the best from me. which is great. That now you immediately see that they have a normative lens of their own. You might say, how are you experiencing this at the moment? And they might talk about how they feel, but they might talk about how they are really trying to find the kind of the breakthrough that's going to unlock something. So it might not be that for them restoration per se is the right approach. They might be like, I'm good with myself if I can figure out the missing piece, the piece that unlocks something here. As you tell me this, what comes up? Do a bit of phenomenological inquiry. What's here and now for you as you talk about this? Or you might reflect. I'm hearing that you want to focus on self-care. I sound like a judgmental you. I'm hearing that you want to focus on self-care, but have I got that right? Is there anything else around this? So you share what's coming up for you, but you open it up, and they might say, no, it's not really self-care. It's ... It's, am I being ethical staying in this organization? It's, can I find the right approach to figure out blah, 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 blah. Can I have the conversation with the HR department that will free up whatever this thing is? So we need to, first of all, clarify the core need without making an assumption. I hope this is resonating with some of you. I'm sure that there'll be some of you here going, of course I would do that. But I'm hoping there are some of you on the call that are going, yeah, I do jump to the conclusion that it's this particular kind of need. So then we can contextualize the need. Let's assume it does become a restorative issue. We want to seek to understand its wider impact. Okay, so it's a restorative issue. How might this issue connect to other areas of your work and practice? Maybe there's other stuff going on in their coaching. Maybe it's going on in their life. Maybe it's like, wow, I'm also going through a divorce and I'm also da-da-da-da-da. What else might be happening that is making this a sort of a bigger restorative issue? What ethical or professional implications are you aware of in this situation? Are they aware? Are they simply focusing on themselves and going, oh, I'm so stressed? Or are they going, I'm so stressed and that is bothering me in terms of my professional ability, et cetera, et cetera. How is the situation impacting your clients at the moment? Now, that's a challenging question. I mean, said in the right way, it's not. But it can feel like a challenging question because the client, the supervisee might feel like, whoa, hold on. Am I being put second here? But the truth is we're looking at the whole system. We're not only looking at the needs of the person in front of us. How well equipped do you feel to deal with this? Formative question. They might say, you know what? I'm very well equipped with it in terms of skills. I just don't have the resources at the moment. Great, we know it's restoration. They might say, if I just had the right approach, I think I'd be okay. Okay, now we know it's a formative conversation with a normative end in mind. Hope that makes sense. It's a formative conversation with a normative end in mind. So then we're going to connect the dots. As you work through the issues, be conscious of connecting the three functions. For instance, how might you move the restorative to the formative, i.e., okay, how might addressing your emotional well-being create space for learning or experimentation? Like if you're so stuck in your stress, you can't even think to try something new. It doesn't matter how much you think of something new, it ain't going to work. So it's a case of, what do I need to do for myself before I move to the formative? But then formative to normative, how might applying this new skill enhance your ethical practice or strengthen your boundaries or whatever the case might be? Normative to restorative, how does clarifying this ethical issue impact how you feel about the situation? One of the things I've noticed in myself over the years is often what I think is going on is not what's going on. I'm sure you've all, I'm not saying anything incredible here. It's just my experience of life. What I think is going on is not what's going on. Sometimes you feel bored of your business. In my case, I'm primarily a business person nowadays more than a coach and a supervisor, but you can have these moments you're like bored or you're just tired of it or it just feels like a problem and you just want to, and then you realize, hold on, I'm not bored of it. I just realized I haven't been doing this thing well enough, or I've lost track of this thing, or I haven't got my vision straight, or whatever it might be. And what you thought was, let's say, a restorative question really becomes a formative question, in a different part of my life, which is business. But that's kind of how it works, is what you think it is not always what it is. And then finally, co-create actions and reflections. You'll all be very effective at this, I'm sure, which is to help your clients make clear decisions and ways forward, but ideally across the board. So in restorative, what support do you feel you need to be more grounded or resourceful? Normative, what steps will ensure you maintain your ethical standards during this time? Formative, what can you practice or learn to strengthen your skills for the next time? And so on. Now, I'm just going to pause for a second again, and let's go see if there are any questions coming up, Izzy?
Yes, we've got two sort of reflections. One from Mike, who says, "This is absolutely resonating. Thanks for reminding me to turn assumptions into questions." And from Hi, I believe that's how I pronounce your name. This is said so simply and yet so insightful, powerful, and meaningful. What I've learned is really deliberately, intentionally know what we do and be in coaching supervision. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much. That's very nice to hear, because as you know, this is my first talk for ICCS. And so I just wasn't sure of the levels. It's lovely to hear that. And I also see somebody asked, will we get the slides? And I've addressed that one, so that's good.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Any other questions before I move to the challenges with this?
No questions, but yeah, really encouraging people to come forward if they've got a question.
It's because I'm so super clear to the nth degree that I leave no room for questions. All right, let's go back to the presentation. So here are the challenges with integrated practice that might come up, not will, might. Number one is time as a factor in integration. If you're doing a kind of a very, very short supervisor session, in terms of you got one session with a supervisee or two sessions with a supervisee, time can be a real factor, because you've got to kind of focus on what's going to move the needle most for this person that's in front of you. If you've been brought in to do a kind of a short, sharp supervision kind of contract for somebody, then time becomes a thing. And likewise, it becomes a thing when you're doing group supervision where there's an itinerant population of supervisees and they're coming and going. It can be difficult to really bring in an integrated approach, because you tend to find you deal with the most surface level thing that pops up. Here's an interesting one, is that there can be cultural considerations with integration. There might be cultures in which the formative is the one that's really expected of you. And when you try to move away into normative or restorative, there can be a real resistance to that. Or it could be that actually the culture is one of the restorative. It's like, hey, you as a supervisor, you're here to kind of support me and hold me. And hold on, you're challenging my ethics even when I'm talking about burnout? What's going on here? There can be culture, and that culture isn't necessarily international culture. It can be cultures within organizations or cultures within schools. Particular, for years and years and years, there was a saying in Animas, which was, that's not very Animas, or that's very Animas, but typically that's not very Animas, which was like, Animas is so soft. How could you do that to us? That's not very Animas. And so there's a culture that can happen within an organization or within a school or within a country or within a professional body that makes one, two of these more dominant. So then you have the situation where supervisees can resist certain pillars. And, that doesn't mean we shouldn't go there, but there can be resistance in dealing with it. And equally, supervisors defaulting to their strengths, even unconsciously, or probably most normally unconsciously defaulting to their strengths, which is why I go back to my earlier point. It's about deliberate practice. It's about taking time out to go, where do I find myself going a lot of the time? Do I find myself doing a lot of formative work? And if so, what am I missing? Do I find myself doing a lot of holding the space in a restorative way? And if so, what am I missing? Do I find myself looking at ethics an awful lot? In which case, what am I missing? And which comes to this point here, which is a lack of reflection by the supervisor. And by the way, that's not a critique in any way. Like, we all have busy lives. The ability to take time to go, what just happened in that session? Sometimes we're going straight from one supervisor to the next, or a supervisor to a coachee, or whatever it might be. It can be difficult. I accept that. But over time, we need to start to become aware of our strengths, our weaknesses, our defaults, and so on. All right, let me bring it all together, and then we'll begin to wrap up. So the three pillars I mentioned at the very start, most of you will be familiar with this, but for those of you who are new to supervision, restorative, normative, and formative, I hope I've kind of talked about that enough now. But to my mind, and I think to everyone's mind, they are interdependent. I promise you, the reason why this seems like such an obvious thing to say, but I feel I need to say it, is I've absolutely seen supervisors take the supervisee down a particular route, like literally speak out the word, it's formative, it's normative, it's restorative, etc. So we have to start to think of them as an independent set. Did I say independent? Interdependent set. Single lens thinking can limit growth and effectiveness, although it can also be very effective for getting immediate results, let's say, or the most effective result in the shortest time. It can be good for that, but in the long run, you want to try to move away from single lens or single function thinking. Hopefully, the 4C model might provide you with a practical framework for integration. It's one I invented off the hoof for this talk, so it's not something I kind of use for years. But what I often do when I think about models is think, what do I do? How do I reverse engineer what I kind of do? And how might that offer that out to you in a way that's, digestible? And then finally, just consider the specific challenges that you might need to adapt to within your particular area of supervision, whether that's the culture you're working within, whether that's the time frame you work within, whether it's the fact you work with itinerant groups, where you have different people coming in and out of those groups, and so you don't have that consistency. Think about what are you facing as a supervisor, and then adapt this to that. That's me done. I don't know what the time is because I don't have my phone in front of me, but I think it's about 10 minutes to go or something, isn't it? So I'm going to close my presentation and see what questions there are left, if any.
Yeah, we've got a few questions. We've got 15 minutes, so that's a good amount of time for these questions. So Hi says, I think that's how you pronounce your name, so apologies if I've got that wrong. What are the limits of this? Or in other words, how do we know what is or when is enough to focus? Maybe an obvious answer is the coach supervisee will know, but maybe it's not all that.
Good question. Hi. From memory, if it's Hi that I think it is, you're in Vietnam. Is that correct? I think Hi. Yeah, fantastic. I'll be going to Vietnam very, very soon, Hi. In fact, I'm curious if you're in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh or somewhere completely different, because it'd be lovely to meet you. Anyway, that's a side note while I think about the answer. I'm bluffing. Right. So one of the most important things, in my opinion, Hi, within coaching and supervision is the quality of unknowing. So I would say the answer to your question is you never know. That's the reality. You're always in dialogue. You're in dialogue about where are we now? Is this achieving what it needs to achieve for you? What might we be missing? What are the blind spots that I've got? What are the blind spots that you've got? So you never really know. You're always in a state of dialogue. What I'm hoping to convey here is less about how you know, and rather how you broaden the scope of what you don't know. So, when we think we know, then we tend to focus on the area. When we think we don't know, we can keep our eyes open for everything that might show up. And that I recognize can be challenging. And I'm not suggesting we just ramble and just constantly never quite settle. But the point is we're always in a state of dialogue and never fully knowing, because it might be you think you know, and then boom, wow, did you just say that? This changes the whole thing. You don't really know, Hi. But what you can do is make the most effective collaborative guess between you. Do we think we're in the right area and yet be open to that being wrong? I hope that makes sense. But I think that's the beauty of coaching and supervision, is that we don't need to know. We're just always in a state of dialogue.
Great. Thank you. From Lisa, does the maturity of the coach impact on how you can use an integrated approach?
The answer is I don't know. You would imagine so, wouldn't you? But at the same time, then I think my initial reaction was probably yes. And then I started thinking, well, why should it be? We're all intelligent human beings that can reflect on our practice. So does it necessarily, so long as the supervisor has the ability to keep that space open and spacious and unknowing, there's no reason in my mind that the supervisor can't draw out what's needed, even if there is a lack of maturity, because the maturity will come through the very dialogue. But I'm not saying that's the answer. I don't know. I've not measured it, is the answer. But I would think that we're always dealing, all coaches. Funny thing, over the years of training coaches and having a coach training school, is the number of people that come to us with immense experience in the world and then become like an innocent reborn into the world as a new coach. It's like they've forgotten that they've got this wisdom from their life. It's the same with supervision. If we're supervising somebody, they've got a lot of wisdom behind them. And yes, their maturity as a coach might not be so high, but that doesn't mean they don't have critical thinking ability. It doesn't mean they can't reflect, because they're a sentient, intelligent human being that's made it to this point in their life. So I don't know the answer, but hopefully that'll be some remote answer.
Great. So we've got a lot of reflections, not too many questions. I don't think we've got any questions beyond beyond Lisa's question there, so I can share some reflections with you. Mary, this is very useful for group supervision, especially when the group is supporting an individual with only one approach. These questions could broaden the issue for the presenter and the whole group to consider it more holistically.
Can I interrupt on that? Because that's brilliant, brilliant. I love that. I hadn't thought of that, but you could definitely do a sort of Edward de Bono approach where you have, the thinking hats, and you could have the hats for each function. You could have somebody inhabits the restorative hat, somebody inhabits the formative hat, etc. That's a lovely idea. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Beatrice, I resonate with a blended approach. When we become supervisors, we often try to preserve the client-led principle from coaching, but we have a stronger responsibility to bring awareness to ethical issues, even when the supervisee might state that their only need is restorative, for example. And that's a mindset shift for us, which is why it's so important to practice our authority as supervisors.
Yeah, 100%. And of course that, I've forgotten who mentioned coaching maturity, but there's also supervisor maturity. That's a model that's not been invented, I don't think. Maybe I should invent that model, the coaching supervisor maturity model. But that's true. That's why I mentioned a few times that new supervisors tend to default to the obvious function, and they stick in that silo quite a lot which is understandable. They're learning new skills. But over time, as you mature as a supervisor, you have this ability to hold the whole system. Thanks, Beatrice.
Michelle, I'm going to use your not code name. For me as an experienced supervisor, this is so useful, both as a refresher and also allowing new awareness to develop.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michelle.
Kate has said, as a non-supervisor, I think these approaches are useful to reflect on post-supervision or post-coaching session to consider different approaches.
Yeah. Let me quickly jump in on that, Kate, because supervision clearly is something I believe in. Otherwise, I wouldn't have created a supervision school and become a supervisor many, many years ago. But, and of course, part of the power of supervision, like in coaching, is it's a relational process. But a lot of supervision can be done by yourself, post-session, post-whatever. You can take these tools. You could read a book on coaching supervision and do it yourself. You wouldn't get the same experience as somebody challenging you and so on, but you could still do it at a certain level. Okay, 3 functions, 7 eyes. You could learn the 7 eye model, and you can go, okay, what do I think about the client? What do I think about the relationship? And You could do all that. No problem at all. Just really useful. Thank you, Kate. Hanoi, fantastic. Hi. I will next time I was in Hanoi recently, but I'm coming back, so I'll see you then.
And Bernadette says, a good framework to explore what is in the field, the shadow where the helicopter landing pad will be, and the felt experience. Thank you for a very informative talk on such an important discipline.
Thank you, Bernadette. A good framework to explore what is... Oh, I've lost it. I like the sound of the helicopter and the... Hold on. Where have we gone? A good framework to explore what is in the field, the shadow where the... Oh, I love it. Wow. Take the screenshot of me. Thank you.
Great. I've just taken a screenshot of that. If you can hear my laptop off. I saw a question come up, so I might just quickly ask that, and then I can continue the reflections afterwards. Do we want to proactively share these 3 pillars with coaches being supervised? I find it helpful to know these 3 pillars as a coach.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I have mixed feelings, and I don't think there's a right or wrong way. It's like, how do you handle it? I think transparency is always good. It's like TA. If you share TA concepts with a client, you can talk it through and work it through together. And it works best in many ways. Transaction analysis. If you're talking about parent-child ego state, all that kind of stuff, share it rather than do it. Brilliant. What's my concern? I think my concern is slightly, this is my in-the-moment concern, but I haven't thought it through well enough. I don't share it because I don't think it's that relevant to share in that way. I think the client, the supervisee experiences what they're experiencing here as opposed to up here in frameworks. And so I worry that it might somehow limit the thinking between us, but I might also be completely wrong. So I would say, do what feels right to you, and I'm sure you'll make it work.
And Hi has raised her hand. Sorry, here. Sorry, Hi.
Right, let me just say something on that, and then I'm going to share one more thing, which I noticed in the chat, and then I guess we'll close off. But I think the important thing, from my perspective, what I feel is important is that we don't think in terms of delineated functions, and we realize that each one is affecting the other. So what you've just said is so critical, because it's what I see a lot. When somebody's in the restorative function, they think they can't really do the other two because they impact the restorative function. It's like, well, if I'm being restorative, I can't really talk normative because that's going to upset the restorative function. It's like, no, quite the opposite. By integrating all three, they support each other. You know, when you believe you're behaving more professionally or ethically, you will feel better about your practice because you can go, wow, okay, that might not feel good, but I'm doing the right thing. Or it might not feel good and I know I'm not doing the right thing. That's going to have a very, very significant ramification to the way you think about everything. So we need to stop thinking that we're doing one thing, and actually all three constantly are integrated. I'm just going to say one more thing and then we're going to close off, and that is, so thank you, Hi. And that was from Helen. Helen, you mentioned the possibility of sharing the three functions, and you've said here, if you share it, it becomes part of the formative pillar. Brilliant, I love it. I can't see you on the screen, but you're absolutely right. If you share the three functions, this is going back to the earlier question around, would you share the three functions with the supervisee? And I said, I probably wouldn't, but I like the idea that what you're doing is you're sharing a model that they can use by themselves. It's lovely. So thank you, Helen, for kind of reframing that. Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I'm not sure how many people are on the call, but I really, really appreciate your time. The next one is coming up in 2 months, and it's going to be on, psychodynamic and systemic perspectives on parallel process. Now, it's not going to be called that because that would not attract many people, but it's called Exploring Parallel Process and Supervision, but I'm going to take a particularly psychodynamic and systemic look at parallel process. So thank you very much, everyone, and I'll see you on the next lecture. Thank you so much, and goodbye.